Well, I was gratified that in his last speech, Dr. Krauss ceased to attack probability theory and logic. Instead, what he says now, it's not enough to prove that God's existence is more probable given the evidence than it is on the background information alone. You've got to discuss the prior probabilities as well. He's absolutely correct. But as he said in his opening speech, that's not the subject of tonight's debate. And that's why we're not looking at, for example, what is the evidence against the existence of God. We're not asking Dr. Krauss to give the evidence against God's existence. We're not talking about the prior probability of God's existence. We're talking about one aspect of the probability calculus, namely, is it the case that God's existence is more probable, given the evidence and the background information I mentioned, than just on the background information alone? If it is, it follows that there's evidence for God. Now, that doesn't prove that God exists, but that's not the topic of the debate tonight, and I've never claimed that it does. I've simply argued that there is evidence that that there is God, and I think that the evidence is clear. What about the first point of evidence, that the existence of contingent beings is more probable on God's existence than on atheism? He didn't deny the point. Remember, I explained to deny the explanatory principle of the universe is to commit the taxicab fallacy. It's arbitrary and unjustified. What about the origin of the universe? Here he accuses me of using God of the gaps reasoning, says we should simply say we don't understand. We should continue to investigate rather than appeal to God. Now, it's very important that you understand tonight that I am not using science to prove God. I'm using science as evidence that the universe began to exist. That is a religiously neutral statement that can be found in any textbook on astronomy and astrophysics. Beyond that, I'm making the extra-scientific philosophical claim that God's existence is more probable given the beginning of the universe than it would have been without it. So the question is, does the scientific evidence support the beginning of the universe? Well, the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem requires it. Vilenkin says the remarkable thing about this theorem is its sweeping generality. We did not even assume that gravity is described by Einstein's equations. The only assumption we made was that the expansion rate of the universe never gets below some non-zero value. This assumption should certainly be satisfied in the inflating false vacuum. The conclusion is that past eternal inflation without a beginning is impossible. So we have both philosophical grounds as well as scientific grounds for affirming the beginning of the universe. Now, Dr. Krauss says, but the Hawking model from quantum tunneling involves a different concept of nothing. There's no classical time and space in the point from which the universe originates. But it is still something. And Vilenkin, who also has a quantum tunneling model, recognizes this. Vilenkin says the initial state from which the universe evolves is not nothing. I understand that a universe of zero radius is not necessarily the same thing as no universe at all. There is a 3 geometry that evolves through quantum tunneling into our space-time. It's not nothing. James Sinclair, a cosmologist, says, this approach still does not solve the problem of creation. Rather, it has moved the question back one step to the initial, tiny, closed, and metastable universe. This universe state can have existed for only a finite time. Where did it come from? Why is Dr. Krauss so insistent on denying the scientific evidence points to the beginning of the universe? That's not a supernatural conclusion. That doesn't imply the existence of God in and of itself. If we follow the scientific evidence where it leads, all of the evidence that I'm aware of points to the fact that the universe is not past eternal. If we have any evidence that the universe is past eternal, I'd love to hear Dr. Krauss present it. I'm not aware that there's any evidence that suggests the universe is past eternal. As I said, the attempts to avoid the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem all involve exotic, implausible models, which in the end fail to restore an eternal past. They just push the beginning back a step. So we've got good philosophical and scientific grounds for thinking the universe began to exist, and since something can't come out of nothing, and I mean non-being, then there must be a transcendent cause to bring the universe into existence, which I think makes God's existence more probable. As for the fine-tuning, we keep getting promissory notices on this, but haven't heard yet why the universe is not fine-tuned for embodied agents. Postulating the existence of many worlds, as Dr. Krauss would want to do, doesn't do anything to explain why we observe a universe structured for embodied interactive agents, unless you can show that the vast preponderance of observable universes are so structured. And that can't be shown. For there are observable universes in which a single brain fluctuates into existence out of the quantum vacuum. Such worlds are not fine-tuned for interactive agents like ourselves, but they are observable. And so just appealing to many worlds doesn't do anything to explain why we observe a world fine-tuned for embodied interactive agents like ourselves. And in any case, that really only kicks the problem up one step, because then you've got to ask about the fine-tuning of the multiverse. What determined its laws that they should be so special? So we've yet to hear, I think, any good explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. Just to give you a couple of stats on this, the fine-tuning of the low entropy condition of the universe is 1 part out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. The fine-tuning of gravity is around 1 part out of 10 to the 36. The fine-tuning of the cosmological constant is around 1 part out of 10 to the 120th. Most scientists think that the universe is fine-tuned for our existence. The real debate is, how do you explain it? Many worlds or a designer? I think I've just shown why the many worlds hypothesis doesn't solve the problem. What about objective moral values and duties in the world? Dr. Krauss says, well, what if God reset morality so that raping little children is wrong? That won't work on my divine command morality theory, because I maintain that God has certain properties like being compassionate, kind, just, fair, so that his commandments are necessary expressions of his essence, of his character. And therefore there is no possible world in which God would command that rape would be good and love would be bad. But in any case, on his view, you can't say anything is bad, because there are no objective moral duties and values. And if you think that that is implausible, then I think you should agree with me that God exists. Finally, as to the resurrection of Jesus, we've not heard any grounds for denying what the majority of historians think about the fate of the historical Jesus, the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith. And it seems to me those are clearly better explained if God exists than if he doesn't. So in summary, it seems to me that while the evidence isn't open and shut, nevertheless, God's existence is more probable given these 5 facts than it would have been without them. And for the limited purposes of tonight's debate, that's enough to prove that there is evidence for God.
Thank you, Dr. Craig. Dr. Krauss.
Dr. Craig is fixated on probabilities. I'm fixated on evidence. They're not the same. Evidence is falsifiable. Evidence is something I can test. I can argue about probabilities, and especially when I don't have an underlying theory, the probabilities don't mean a lot. When I don't have a mathematical, in fact, probabilities only make sense in the concept of a mathematical construction. Otherwise, they're just shooting in the dark. Of course, what Dr. Craig has argued is on the basis of the evidence, the probability is greater than not than there's a God. I don't like to necessarily use probabilities, but I'll use one probability. I'll take the members of the National Academy of Sciences, who are scientists, who looked at the evidence. Okay? 90% of the members of the National Academy of Sciences don't find any evidence for God. They don't believe in God. They were polled. Now, does that mean there's no God? It doesn't mean it at all. It means 90% of the best scientists in the country who look at the evidence find no evidence for God. If that's a probability, that's a probability I can actually quantify, not one I invent in my head. So somehow, the scientists involved who look at the evidence that Dr. Craig has presented don't see any evidence for God. 90% of them. Okay? Now, not even 50%. If it was 51%, according to Dr. Craig, we'd win, but 90% don't believe in God. Now, The claim Alex Vilenkin has one model of creating a universe from nothing, which I actually worked on around the same time. It's different than Stephen Hawking's. We don't know which is correct at this point because we don't have a good theory of quantum gravity. But they're very different. In quantum gravity, unlike what Dr. Craig has said, and you'll have to trust me on this because I actually know general relativity, is that there is no free space. It's not that a free space existed before tunneling. There is no free space. In the same sense that any of those particles that I showed coming from empty space existed before quantum fluctuations produced them. They didn't exist. They exist for a short time, so short you can't measure them, and then they cease to exist. That's the way the world works. In quantum gravity, there's no pre-existing free space. It just is created. So that notion is not correct. Whether or not the universe is past eternal or not, which is again something Dr. Egg is fixated on, is itself a very fascinating question. In the theory, by the way, that he's talking about, one version of the theory, the universe is future eternal. So it is eternal. It had a beginning. There are other versions, however, in which case it is not. It is past eternal. It is eternal over all times. But that question itself, I repeat, the beginning of the universe is a fascinating thing. We know our observable universe had a beginning. We know that. That's not a philosophical statement. It's a scientific one. And I repeat that evidence involves science, not philosophy. Philosophy doesn't define evidence for anything. It provides a logical framework for understanding things, but the only thing that determines evidence is reality, empirical reality, not philosophy. And you have to ask yourself the question each time, I repeat, that Dr. Craig claims that this requires God, is there a plausible physical explanation? And I've already shown you that space can be created from nothing plausibly. It's possible in a multiverse that the laws of physics, the laws of nature themselves are created spontaneously. They didn't pre-exist. It's possible. You have to ask yourself, am I willing to say that because all of these possibilities are interesting, but I don't understand them, there must be a God who's compassionate, kind, what were the words you used? Compassionate, kind, a bunch of other words to describe him or her. Well, that's true, by the way. First of all, that's clearly not the God of the Old Testament, who's not compassionate nor kind, right? That's obvious. So it's a certain kind of God that you choose to be compassionate and kind. But hold on, doesn't God define those things? But if he's required to be kind and compassionate, then who required him to be kind and compassionate? Who defined kind and compassionate? Get out of the middleman. Rationality defines kind and compassionate. All of you, if you did not believe in God, and the people in here who find the evidence for God lacking, are unlikely to go out and kill someone or rape someone tonight because of that. Rationality goes a long way to understanding morality. Rationality, evolution, biology. Does it completely define morality? I don't know. In fact, the institute that I run had a wonderful workshop on the origin of morality, trying to look at neurophysiological basis, philosophical basis of morality. Because instead of deciding by fiat that the only origin of morality could be God, we want to look at the question and ask. And so, I promised I'd get to fine-tuning, so let's get to fine-tuning. What Dr. Craig gets wrong is that the entropy of the universe is not fine-tuned. It's generated. We have a dynamical mechanism to generate it. I've heard him say that these certain quantities are not determined by the laws of physics. Well, most of them are. The matter-antimatter asymmetry, which he says is fine-tuned for life, which isn't, by the way, is also, we have a mechanism to determine it. We do know that there are quantities whose values are very weird, like the value of the energy of empty space, which he said is fine-tuned to be 10 to the minus 120. Well, that's true. It's fine-tuned. I was one of the first people to show that. But it's fine-tuned within the context of physical theory. Our physical theories predict it should be 120 orders of magnitude larger than it is. We don't understand why it's as small as it is. But its smallness does not fine-tune for life. If it were 0, which is what we thought it was, life would exist perfectly well. And it's much easier to understand why it's 0 from a mathematical perspective, which is why all of us theoretical physicists thought it was, until the universe told us it wasn't. All logic, all science told us that the only sensible value for the energy of empty space, in which there's nothing, was nothing. And life would exist perfectly well in such a universe. What did we discover? It's not nothing. We still don't understand why. It's the biggest mystery in science. It means we don't understand most of the universe. What could be more exciting? But what we have learned, by the way, is the fact that it isn't nothing means we live in the worst of all possible universes for life to develop in. A universe with energy and empty space has life ending before any universe in which empty space doesn't have energy. So if this miraculous fine-tuning, which I agree is remarkable and I wish I'd understand, was created for life, then the person who created it didn't do a very good job. A rather competent, intelligent designer. The universe is the way it is, whether we like it or not. And all the evidence of the universe is that there's no purpose, no design, no meaning. Should that upset us? No, and I'll explain why in my concluding remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Krauss. We now